Well, welcome back, everyone. And we're on to our next session. And I just want to let you know that, one of the things about being a leader is you have to have the ability to quickly pivot. And it's a skill that you get lots of experience at the higher you go within an organization. So whenever you get that chance, take full advantage of it. So this morning, I had to pivot. Unfortunately, Jennifer Johnson, who was going to be one of our speakers today, sent me an email saying that she had her plane canceled last night from BC. So unfortunately, she's on a flight right now and she couldn't be with us. But we have a replacement. We're very lucky. And I'm going to ask Matthew Cutler in a moment to introduce our replacement. And Erin, are we still good?
We are.
All right, super. So Matthew Cutler was with the Winnipeg government as an assistant deputy minister, and he's a friend of IPAC. He has been a champion for us. He recently moved over to be vice president of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And he's going to lead this session for us, which is going to focus on how effective communication can really make a difference for you at work, in your career, and obviously, in your personal life also. So Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, David. And thanks everybody for joining today. It's so exciting to see such a large group of new professionals in the public service gathered together, investing in the craft of public service. I think now more than ever, the work that we do supporting citizens and services is critical to society. And so I'm so glad to see that you're taking the time to grow your capacity to do that work. As David said, I'm Matthew Cutler. I'm the Vice President of Exhibitions at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So I'm a member of the Federal Public Service, have joined the museum just in the last few months, and before that worked in Manitoba's Public Service, the Toronto Public Service, and then in international and local NGOs prior to that. I'm coming to you from Treaty 1 territory, from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Ithinawak and Innuwak, Anishinaabeg, Dene Sulin, Dakota Kadnakota Oyate, and the birthplace and homeland of the Red River Métis. And I know you're all coming from other parts of the country. You've probably spent some time this morning thinking about the land that you're on and why that matters. But it's important to me to start in that way. I'm joined today by some great folks. So Sandra, I don't know about replacement, but Sandra's definitely a great addition to the team. I'll have our two panelists introduce themselves in their own words, but important to note that Sandra comes to us as Director of Strategic Innovation and Design at the Government of New Brunswick. And I got to know her when she was part of the Manitoba's Public Service. So she joined Team New Brunswick after working at Wawanesa, Manitoba's Public Service, North Forge, University of Winnipeg. She has a reputation of working in spaces around innovation and strategic disruption and strategy, and also has a formidable social media presence and personal brand that I think she'll get to talk to a little bit. Helena is with us. She's just freshly retired, June 2022, from her time as RBC's Chief Human Resources Officer. In that role, you can imagine she's a member of the executive group, these 9 folks who steered the entire organization of this massive financial institution, 86,000 employees in 29 countries. And so her expertise over decades with RBC, I'm not sure if I should mention, she started in 1985. I think that's an incredible career and a lot of history that she'll bring to the table today as we talk about how we show up at work and how we share ourselves and our experiences in a way that advances our career. So maybe we'll start there with introductions, and I'll start with Helena. Maybe take us a bit through your journey. You were a new professional once. Now you're a retired professional, and how did you get to this room today?
Yeah, well, I'll try to sum up 35 plus years in 2 minutes or less. So I actually started my career right out of university. I went to Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, and was hired by RBC in Vancouver. And my first posting after the training program was in Victoria, and I worked in the retail branch network. I'll call it like client-facing roles in a number of different branches in Victoria and then in Vancouver. And in those days, we still had quite a regional presence as far as functional roles. So I had the opportunity to work in human resources at the regional level in Vancouver, and then go back out into the retail branch network, managing people. And way back in, I guess it was 2002, we moved to Calgary. So we had an opportunity to live a couple of years in Calgary, where I had accountability for about 45 branches and 6 business banking centers. And then from there, we traveled across the country to Toronto and had a number of jobs in client strategy and HR. And I've spent the last 10 years of my career, 10 plus years actually, in HR related roles, the last 5 being head of HR, located out of Toronto. So I'm now resident back in BC. We made the trek back west, living in the Okanagan Valley in Kelowna. So we've seen many different areas of the country back and forth, but are happy to be back in BC, close to family and friends. Oh, I should mention that even though I've retired from RBC, I'm still actively engaged with 2 not-for-profit organizations, one being Plan International Canada. Hopefully, some of you have heard of that organization, where we focus on children's rights and equality for girls, particularly in developing countries. And I have been involved with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, currently a director, will become chair of that organization this spring. And our goal is to find a cure for type 1 diabetes. So those are the 2 not-for-profits that I've been able to give more time to, I'll say, in the last several months, which is great.
I love that you highlight those things as we talk about brand and communications in the workplace. The other things that we bring to the workplace, the other things we do and care about, is so important as well. So that's super helpful. Sandra, what about you? Where did you start, and how did you get to where you are today?
First of all, can everybody hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. It's hard to follow after Helena's introduction, but I'll try. I'm Sandra Hodzik, as Matt has said, and so I come to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba. I have spent most of my professional career in the public sector. So I have about 12 years of experience in the Manitoba government, which is where I actually met Matt. And so during that time, I sort of bounced around from various department to department, trying to find my way, trying to figure out, what do I feel passionately about? I knew it was community. I knew it was sort of being in a position that weaves together sort of grassroots and individual actors and activists and organizations to sort of that policy area that isn't always well connected to what's going on in the field. I wanted to be in that middle space and see how we can bring everyone together. So I've done that in a few different departments. I spent some time in labor and immigration, looking at improving integration of foreign trained professionals, which is a topic that's extremely near and dear to me because it's a path that my family has followed in their immigration journey into Canada. So I've spent some time there. I also spent some time looking at how we can create some impact in reducing the very high number of Indigenous children in government care, which is the unfortunate reality here in Manitoba. So I spent some time in the Department of Families and sort of getting into sort of the depths of social service. I spent a little bit of time in health, and sort of more recently in the last 5 or 6 years before I exited the Manitoba government, working more centrally in looking at how can I help government figure out, in the age of austerity and depleting resources, how can we figure out how to do more and create more impact with less money and less resources. And so I was really fortunate to have had the opportunity of crafting Manitoba's social finance strategy and looking at how do we co-create better policies with members of the public, individual actors and organizations to create better outcomes versus sort of doing it in a vacuum off the side of our desks without that profound engagement piece. And so I also was one of the folks that co-created Manitoba's first social innovation office, which looked at housing all sorts of interesting and creative policies and programs that enhance the way that we serve the public and improve our service delivery generally. And I sort of left and spent some time in the private sector working on still in the innovation space, as Matt has said, but just more on the product innovation. I was one of the leaders in the innovation lab at an insurance company. It was okay. I learned a lot of stuff. I decided to eventually go back to my first love, which is government. And so I've had the privilege and unique opportunity of being 100% remote worker. So we talk about communication, effective communication. I feel like, that is hitting me all the time in my role because I work for a government in Atlantic Canada, in the government of New Brunswick. So I'm overseeing innovation and strategy and design for the sector there. And I get to do amazing stuff with creative people all across government and the community towards strengthening the way that we collaborate to deliver services, the way that we engage our communities, and the way that we operate as an organization in that government overall. So, I've had this interesting path, but it's all sort of culminated to how can we do things differently and how can we insert a degree of innovation or creativity in the way that we're overcoming large policy problems. And sort of training wise, I did a double master's in public and business administration from the University of Manitoba. And it turns out that was a good focus for me because I feel like it challenges me and forces me to use it every day in every role that I've had. So that alignment sort of just, I would say, organically came to be. So that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Sandra. And we'll come back to that remote piece because I do think, I've seen you embrace Team NB from the middle of the country, right? And be embraced by that team too. And I think that speaks to how we show up in the workplace and how we communicate our role and our value. Maybe we'll take a step back first though, and just think about public service today, right? I was a big lover of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister growing up. This idea of powerful bureaucrats who are behind the scenes, making the organization run, seemed so fascinating to me, but it's quite distant, I think, from the way that we all show up in our jobs today. The nature of public service has changed. This idea of loyal, nameless, faceless technocrats who provide fearless advice and loyal implementation isn't quite practical anymore as we engage with communities, as we are public people. It's not just the elected officials now who are in the public sphere, and as we navigate internal politics. So I wonder, from your experience, and we'll maybe start with Helena, what does it take today in that digital context, in that diverse context that we work in, to be a good employee, to be a good public servant in today's climate?
Well, I've never worked in the public service, so I'll definitely speak or provide some comments as it relates to employees in general, which I'm sure is transferable to the public service as well. When people talk about loyalty, and we've had so many, I was a 35 plus year employee of the same company, and a lot of people say, oh, that would never happen again in today's world. And when I think back when I was first hired and the cohort of the 15 people that went through the same training program, I'm the only one that actually stayed 37 years. So, way back when employees, did leave after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years, depending on, what paths they decided to follow. So loyalty, in my view, is not a thing of the past. And I think building loyalty, though, in this new world post-pandemic, I think has really shifted. So as workforce needs change, as employees join organizations, whether it be the public service or whether it be other organizations, what employees are looking for from their employer has absolutely shifted. And how employees work has shifted. and where employees work has shifted. So all of that comes into play as far as how employees show up. What does it mean to be a good employee? For me, it really comes down to some very simple things. I think employees, to be a good employee, you need to show up with the intent to make an impact, that you actually want to make a difference through the work that you do. And all the research will show you that employees stay with organizations if they feel they're making an impact and if they feel they're doing meaningful work. But employees have to come to the table wanting to make that impact. I also think to be a good employee, and um, Sandra spoke to this briefly in her opening comments. Employees have to be willing to, communication skills and speaking up and sharing ideas and thoughts are really, really important. And equally important is the ability to listen. So being a terrific listener and also being a good communicator is really, really important, particularly in this world of diversity and inclusion, DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really being willing to listen for understanding, listen to learn. I mean, if I shared my learnings over 30 plus years in the D&I and ecosystem, it would be amazing. It would be, I mean, for some folks, mind-boggling. In the last 3 years of my career, I had to learn about transgender. We had a very senior leader who was transitioning and needed our support to come out in a large organization like RBC. And this particular leader had close to about 25,000 employees under her remit. So you can imagine what it took to educate, to inform, and to communicate that. So understanding D&I in the context of your work and continually learning is so important. I think to be a good employee, you have to be adaptable and agile. I think in today's world, it's impossible to be a good employee if you aren't someone who can go with the flow when needed to. Sometimes you set out on a team sets out on a path, and a curveball comes their way. You have to be able to adapt and deal with what comes your way. And I think we learned that in spades during the pandemic. I led, and we might talk about this a little bit later on, but I led RBC's response to the pandemic and what support we needed to provide employees, both our employees who had to work on site and what that meant. How did we protect their health and safety while working on site? And those that had the opportunity to work from home, and how did we adapt our ways of working, the tools and resources we used, etc. So adaptability in today's world for me is like almost a table stakes capability that employees need to bring to the table. I think to be a good employee, it's not one way. I think for me, it's reciprocal. Organizations and employees both have a role to play to create a culture where employees can be the best that they can be. It's not all the organization giving, it's not all the employee receiving. It's both giving and receiving that really creates culture and creates an environment where employees can be the best that they can be. So there's so much that goes into being a good employee, but it is definitely reciprocal. I always say, when people ask me, why did I stay as long as I did? My response is pretty simple. One, I was provided so many wonderful career opportunities along the way that I could reinvent myself multiple times. I didn't have to quit to do something different. So that was one reason. A huge reason were the relationships that I had developed with people over the years that I still lean into today, 6 months into my retirement. And I was one of the lucky ones where I did, and my family was willing to follow me on our adventures. where, you know, relationships with people in British Columbia, in Alberta, in Ontario, and then in my last job globally, being able to meet people, work with people on projects and initiatives that touched employees across multiple jurisdictions. So relationships. I always felt I came close to leaving RBC once, and the real reason I didn't leave, and the reason I was wanting to leave, was to get back to closer to home. We were missing our friends and family, but the reason I stayed was because of the relationships I had developed over time, and being able to do meaningful work with wonderful people. And then the third reason is just the organization that you work for. For me, it was RBC. For others, it's, you know, wherever you sit in government or public service, that the values of that organization align with your personal values. If they're out of sync, it's very hard to show up every day and be a good employee. And so, you know, your values, your personal values, have to align with the organization's, the values that you see play out in the organization that you work for. So I'll stop there. I said a lot in a few minutes, but there's so much that goes into being a good employee. But I guess the one big message I would leave is that it is a reciprocal relationship. It's a give and a get on both ends.
Thanks, Selena. Just a couple things before we toss back to Sandra. So you're talking about your colleague who happens to be a common connection and friend of ours, because Katie sits on the board of trustees, was appointed by cabinet to serve on the board of CMHR.
Just recently, actually.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'll just drop some details about Katie in the chat, because I think she's such a good example of effective leadership and communications in the workplace. So I'll share that with folks as well. In terms of this note, like, I'm thinking about the loyalty piece that Helena put forward. And for me, I think that in the public service, we have the benefit of that loyalty being to public service, to public administration. In that I haven't stayed with one organization my whole career, but I feel like I have, right? Whether it was the Toronto's public service, Manitoba's, and now the federal public service, I still feel that loyalty and connection to the craft and the calling. And I'm curious, Sandra, from your perspective, how that's felt for you, because you've moved orders and organizations, and what you've seen in that space about what it means to be a good public servant today at our age and stage of career.
Yeah, so my perspective is going to be, you know, from the lens of being a leader of public sector innovation, right? And that innovative piece driving my take on the responsibility that I have and that my team has towards furthering what it means to be a good public servant, what it means to be a steward of public funds, what it means to deliver great quality-based services that are actually attributed and responsive to the needs and ailments that we see in our community. So in following that innovation methodology, if we have any social innovators on the call here or enthusiasts, my first area of focus and responsibility is seeking to understand, before I do anything, is seeking for that deep understanding of my clientele, right? Before we create a policy that is going to reduce the rate of homelessness or improve the recruitment of healthcare professionals from abroad or do anything, the first point is, how do you know this is an issue? Have you done user research? So really getting in touch with your target audience. And I think this is applicable in both the public and private sectors. You know, Helena spoke a little bit about impact. I can definitely relate to that. In order to create that impact through awesome social services, your first point of contact is, you know, your clientele, speaking to them, really understanding whether it's through formal consultations, whether it's through a sample, whatever it is, that connects to members of the public within the public service realm of answering this question. I think that's key. And I think it also speaks to the need to co-create, right? So it's less about, I'm the great knower of what you need sitting here in an ivory tower in government, right? I know what you need, I'm going to create for you. It's less about that and more of this like organic, non-ego approach to co-creation, which is rooted in tell me what you need and how can we fix this together? And that's more of my focus. And so in doing that, I think one area of focus for every organization this day and age is, how do we responsibly leverage technology to increase that co-creation, to make ourselves as a government more responsive to the needs of the public, whether it's getting quick permits, whether it's getting access to eliminate flooding in their basement or whatever, instead of waiting 12 hours, right, to speak to some generic person that's just going to, triage your call to somebody else. Is like, how can we leverage technology and provide in the moment services to improve that service delivery, the way that you would seek to do in any other private sector organization. I do think government's kind of moving towards that same efficiency. So to me, being a good public servant is co-creating and also being available and responsive. And I think one thing that we can do to leverage technology to allow us to do that is look at what other industries are doing. I spent some time in the private sector, in the financial services sector, in insurance, and banking. Probably you can speak to this, Helena, as well, is how do we leverage quick tools like chatbots? You guys have seen them. You've gone shopping. Amazon does them. You spent a few too many minutes on the page. Little chatbot pops up and says, how can I help you? What that does is it gives you access to a person or a proxy that helps you answer your questions and gets you what you need in a timely, efficient manner. So instead of you having to wait 12 hours to get access to that funding or to get an answer to something that's so simple, you actually get it in the moment. And we're seeing this everywhere else. So why wouldn't we see it in government? I think government's certainly following suit. Furthermore, I think there's an onus and a responsibility of government to actually increase that communication and collaboration with the public by making themselves essentially more available. So those are my two things: is availability, being able to be reached, and actually taking your audience along for the ride as opposed to doing something to them. I think that's the biggest thing for me. And I think that that's a responsibility that is so great. And I think all of us as public servants have that and need to think about how we can create that positive impact in everything that we do. So I'll just stop there because I know you probably want to take that bit in a couple of different directions.
Well, Sandra, we'll stick with you for a second and say, so, you're talking about this new sort of unmediated relationship with the public, right? It's about engagement, it's about design thinking, evaluation. So we are far more engaged now with our citizens, our customers, our ministers, than perhaps we were 2-3 decades ago in the public service. And so who we are, right? Like who Sandra is when she shows up matters to those relationships, perhaps more than ever before, because we are in relationship now with our clients and our citizens and our elected officials. So what do you think about in terms of personal, professional brand? What do you think about when you show up at work, about how you communicate yourself, who you are? Brand might be a word some folks would use, what your brand is. What's your approach to that in your career?
Great question. I'll go back to what Helena referenced a few minutes ago as well, which is really sort of, I think there was some talk about authenticity there as well, and just really understanding the values that the organization has and assessing whether or not those values align with your own personal values for fit. So for me, in assessing how I communicate with my ministers, my elected officials, or in my previous example, the public, right? Or even my own team that I manage, I think, in terms of deciding what I want to project, my first point of reference would be to have that self-awareness. Check myself. What is it that I have as an intent? What's the message behind? What am I trying to achieve with this spiel or this post, if I'm posting on social media, with this interaction, right? So really understanding and asking myself difficult questions, and being a huge fan of Brené Brown, right? I think a lot of you probably on the call, if you're policy people like myself, and social psychologists probably are familiar with her work. She talks about vulnerability and authenticity. I think to me, the other lens that I like to take when I approach that developing my good personal brand and effective communication is really communicating with a great deal of authenticity. And sometimes that requires vulnerability. And Brené Brown talks about, don't be vulnerable for the sake of being vulnerable. Don't have like this like emotional spiel in front of large audiences for the sake of opening yourself up to like some sort of hyperbolic personal story, unless you're trying to make a point, unless there is a segue somehow, unless you're trying to tell the story for the sake of strengthening and connect to your audience and enhancing your ultimate message. So one thing that I try to do, and I mean, for those of you that follow me on LinkedIn, I'm extremely vulnerable and I like to be real there. And I like to create a community, virtual community, because I'm 100% remote, that resonates and can relate to the messages and the content that I post there. And that's often the approach I take when I'm briefing a minister or the premier as well, is this is what you need. This is me authentically letting you know what you need based on what you what you requested. This is me having the self-awareness of who my audience is and kind of letting that guide me, right? So I might adjust that message depending on whether it's a social media post or whether it's a very formal audience. But either way, I think I'm going to get to what I want to get to. It's just that my approach might differ slightly. So I may not be as vulnerable, or I might be vulnerable within the caveat that hey, this minister probably doesn't have a ton of time for this personal anecdote. How can I be very concise and effective and efficient while still kind of honoring my own policy, my own individual policy of how I prefer to communicate. So one thing, I'll give you a quick example, and I'm sure Helena has something to add to this too, is I like to tell stories. So I fancy myself a storyteller. So that's often how I develop content on social media, and in work, I do a little bit of that as well. So a few years ago, I had an unfortunate situation returning back to work from maternity leave. If any of you are parents on the call, right? So I'm extremely career focused. I felt really vulnerable, and I thought, it's going to be a tender journey coming back to work, but I was ready to just kind of dig deeply into the work itself and do my thing. And so I was on this really long call. It was sort of with our entire leadership team. I think there was about 120 people on the call. And I had a new vice president that wasn't familiar with all of my work. And she had kind of come into power while I was away on maternity leave. So she had sort of ample notes on the impacts that I had created and some of the things that I had done in the organization. And so what she chose to do was introduce me in terms of this brand, the following brand. It was something along the lines of, this is Sandra. She's a returning mother, new mother coming back from mat leave. She's trying to make her way. That was it. Okay. That was the beginning and the end. And that is definitely something that caught me off guard. It's not my professional brand. It is not something that I would have said. And I thought it was kind of peculiar to personify me that way in that particular setting. So while that was true, it didn't do justice to all the stuff that I had hoped would be talked about, all the great stuff that I did, things I received accolades for, and also the things that I would continue to do. And I was really, really disappointed. And what I did was put my head down, and I spent the next year and a bit hustling, doing my thing, creating, delivering, shining, doing all of those things that I had done before, not in spite of the comment, not in spite of this leader, but to respect myself and my personal brand and my goal and what I wanted to put out there, which is, hey, I do all of these things which are valuable, not the least of all, which is being a parent and a mother. I can do, and that is my brand. And it's not either or, it's that duality, and it's both of those things. So I think that, to me, it's just about me defining what my brand is and getting ahead of the curve versus leaving it to members of the public or my leaders to define that for me. So what's important to me is like really getting ahead of it and telling you how I prefer to be engaged with and what I'm good at and what my personal flavor is, rather than you telling me that passively through the stuff that I put out there. So sometimes the two match, but in my case, it was really, really important that, I demonstrate this is what I'm good at. And I've proved it to myself, but also to the people that need to know that as well. So I don't know if that's a roundabout way of sort of touching upon the question. I hope it was valuable, but I wanted to throw that in there.
Thanks for sharing that story, Sandra. And I think in particular, your comments about vulnerability really struck me because coming through the pandemic And I bet Helena has some great examples of this from her leadership in COVID response with employees. Lines blurred, right, about what was personal life and professional life, what we share, what we don't share. I'm not sure we've fully settled in this space to know how much, like, we bring our full selves to work, but that also doesn't mean that we're, you know, your reference to Brene, that we're just being aggressively vulnerable all the time for the sake of it. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that, Helena, from your time. Where is this line now, and how do we manage ourselves and
Yeah.
our vulnerability in the workplace?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Let me first just talk a little bit about brand, and then I'll go there,
Mhm.
Matthew. I really appreciated Sandra's comments. Brand is a really broad topic, and it's not something you can necessarily orchestrate. Certainly, you can influence, but brand is also about just how you show up each and every day at work, the quality of your work, the are you dependable? Like, when you say you'll do something, do you get it done? That all contributes to your brand as an employee through the course of your career. Awareness about the impact that you have on others. And for me, when I think back, when I had to, my brand was built way before social media was ever a thing. And it's about caring, caring about the work, caring about the people you work with. So that notion of authenticity and being able to, the consistency too. So authenticity, but also consistency, and allowing yourself to get excited, allowing yourself to, that to who you are at work shouldn't be significantly different to how you behave at home. And if it is, then are you acting at home or are you acting at work? Because it's who you are. A lot of who you are, those personal characteristics are hardwired. So, brand is very much something that, and certainly you can build brand through social media, etc. There's no doubt. So your question was around the balance of vulnerability and through the pandemic. I think it's very personal, Matthew. People. I was always one to talk about my family, to talk about my son, my husband. People know I'm married, that my husband followed me, quote unquote, to Calgary and then to, Toronto, and had to reinvent himself. I never, that's who I am. But I have colleagues who don't open the book about their family, and they choose not to. It doesn't mean that they're not willing to be vulnerable. That's just not who they are. And that's okay too. You can be authentic without sharing stories about your family. And it's choosing the moments when vulnerability is appropriate. That to me is really important. Is it appropriate? Let me, think about vulnerability and maybe some examples. So I've had moments at work where I was so frustrated that you want to close the door behind you and scream, okay, or cry because your frustration comes through emotion that maybe causes you to cry. Pick and choose what colleagues you might want to cry in front of. If I was at the group executive meeting at RBC during the pandemic, with at that time when the pandemic started, I was the only woman around the table with 8 other men. If I had cried, that would have been uh, counterproductive, not good for my brand. If I was one-on-one with the CEO and I had some frustration and a few tears showed up, he'd be okay with that. So you have to know when you can let that vulnerability show and have enough self-control to either compartmentalize, remove yourself from a situation if it's over emotional, and or not. So vulnerability is something that's very personal. We all react differently. We're all willing to share. We're all at different levels, and I don't think people should feel that to be successful, you have to be an open book. You don't have to be an open book. Not everyone has not everyone's comfortable with that. And that's okay. Some people are too much of an open book, and it's, dialing it back. I think in this hybrid world, I think it's been very interesting. Hybrid and fully remote, some folks are fully remote, some are now hybrid, some are back in the office. And I think I think senior leaders, particular people in more senior roles, it was really interesting to see how they how you saw the office behind them, or the view behind, or a dog barking in the background, or a partner bring them a cup of coffee. It was really interesting to allow some of the personal come into work, and I think that's really actually healthy. I think people have to find what they're comfortable with. It has to be business appropriate, but at the same time, I think we're all people. We spend a lot of time with our colleagues at work, whether it be remote, whether it be in the office. And it's very hard to build relationships without making some personal connection. So you do have to allow some of the personal to come through, and be very, very respectful of what the right balance is. And it's different. I don't think there's a clear right or wrong. I think there is an example where there's too much, but it's finding the balance that you're comfortable with. And if you have transparent and open relationships with the colleagues you work with, if you're going too far, people will coach you, and that's okay.
I've got a great question in the chat that I want to come to, but I want to pick up on your point about hybrid, because I know Sandra's got some key thinking on this. Your comment about seeing people outside of the workplace, though, for about 18 months, every cabinet meeting was on Teams like this. Just imagine, a government's cabinet meeting in this way, and that dynamic with ministers, seeing their homes, seeing their, as you say, family bringing them a drink. It changed the way that we did government during that time, and I think
it humanizes people. I think it humanizes people, to be honest with you. Like, I think, okay, I'll talk about my last boss at RBC, Dave Mackay, CEO, and you think of this guy who has so much power. You know what? He's a father. He's a husband, he's a son, he's an uncle, and it humanized, very senior people and down. And I think that's important, because we're all human. At the end of the day, we're all human. We all have challenges. They're different, but everyone during the pandemic, I think it really shone a light that everyone had different issues, different challenges they had to deal with, whether you were a single mother trying to manage homeschooling while working, or someone who's never worked at home before and just found it very distracting, or a young person stuck in an apartment by themselves and dealing with loneliness because they were isolated. So, everyone had something, and it really humanized. I really appreciated that, actually, about the pandemic. I hope that we never lose that notion of caring and understanding that, we are all human at the end of the day, with different challenges that we have to be mindful of.
Absolutely. And as we think past, and we're not out of the pandemic, but we're certainly moving to a new normal. And the old tools don't work in the same way, as we're a bit more hybrid. Some of us are fully remote. Some of the tricks that I used as a new professional, I'd always greet senior management by their first name when I saw them in the lobby of Toronto City Hall. And honestly, the first few times they had no idea who I was, but I learned that after a few times of them seeing this guy walk by and say, hi, Chris, they might ask someone, who's that person? And I started to build my reputation and brand the organization by being friendly in really casual ways. You don't have the lobby to walk through when you're working hybrid or remote as often. And Sandra does this, right? Sandra's in Winnipeg, but working for Team New Brunswick. What are your top 3 tools you use to maintain your communications, relationships, your brand in a public service that's a bit far from you, Sandra?
Yeah, great question. I'm a huge fan of horizontality, right? I'm a fan of figuring out, how can we flatten the civil service? How can we flatten the organizations that we're a part of? How can we move away from rigidity, hyper hierarchy and really look at our leaders as mentors and folks that happen to be in those positions with those particular titles at that given time. And how do we look at them as people that are trying to make a difference just like us, and us all being on that same team? So I don't know. I mean, that's, maybe it's a generational thing, maybe it's just a Sandra specific thing, but I'm lucky enough to work in an organization right now that share some of those values, going back to what we were saying about alignment and values earlier today on this call. So in kind of creating and flattening the organizations and doing the great work and partnerships with the rest of the talented people I'm surrounded by, I try to really focus on relationship building. And I know that everybody says, you know, networking is so important. You can be as smart as, you know, anybody out there, any top leader, any VP, any SVP, but if you do not have that great EQ or self-awareness or relationship and networking sort of side to you, that it really may go unnoticed. So I feel like as soon as I started taking that seriously in my career, I did start to notice a difference. So it was hard for me because I think my starting point was to be a little bit more of a wallflower, was to be a little bit more withdrawn, was to be a little bit more, I don't want to be noticed. And so I've had to force myself to really come out of my shell, especially in this role, because if I don't develop those relationships, if I'm not strategic with introducing myself, with understanding what it is that keeps my leaders up at night and how I, through my skill set and my team skill set, can be useful in helping those leaders overcome those challenges, then they may not know that. We may not overcome whatever obstacle we're striving to work through. So it's really being intentional and proactive in building those relationships by actually putting that time into my calendar every week. So what I'll do is, when I started in the government in New Brunswick, it wasn't like the government in Manitoba where I built those relationships organically through the meetings and projects I was on. I didn't have a starting point. Nobody knew what I was good at. Nobody knew, except the people that hired me, all the cool stuff that I had done. I didn't understand what's important to them. So I reached out to my leader and asked her to facilitate some of those discussions, to connect me. And then I took the onus upon myself to kind of start the conversation. So rather than splurging and saying, this is what's so great about me, like I'm very passionate, I like to talk about what I bring to the table, I had to be really intentional about leaning that back. And really, we talked about listening, like what's important to you as an ADM? What's important to you as a director? What's important to you as a policy analyst? What are some things that are priority for you? What are you working on? And then based on gathering that information, really looking at strategic opportunities for working together, cross-pollinating, collaborating towards collective problem solving. So the first thing that I've had to do was sort of relationship build, be really good at it, make a point of putting that on my calendar the way I would do for a meeting that I was invited to. The second thing that I've done to kind of tackles, I think what you touched upon briefly around, I think one of you mentioned it, during the pandemic, we were all really estranged and withdrawn, and we all worked from home. And I think that feeling of community was lost. I still feel the remnants of that, being 100% remote, right? So I'm all the way halfway across the country. I'm by myself on an island. So I have to be really thoughtful about creating a sense of community and being very connected to the issues that are important to New Brunswick, and also to my own team and to my leaders. And one way that I do that is through just public forums and leveraging social media. And I know that's partially the theme of today, is what does it mean to be methodically and responsibly involved and present in social media? I feel like that's my way, that's my avenue of being connected to something bigger than me. So I talk about things that are important to me. I talk about things that I'm working on. I talk about things that I'm passionately about. And I talk about understanding what my followership and my audience on social media, on LinkedIn primarily, wants to see from me. For those of you that leverage LinkedIn, you'll see you have access to all sorts of analytics. So you know who is following you, what are they interested in, where do you get the most likes, and at what time. So I really interpreted that really strategically to understand where do I get bang for my buck? If I post this content at this particular time, is it going to engage my audience, the people that I want to reach out to? And how will they reach back out to me? Because I'm looking to fill part of that loneliness void that sometimes comes part and parcel with being a remote employee. So that's one way. Another way that I really start to be connected. And a lot of the folks that I do business with in government in Atlantic, Canada right now are people that I'm connected with in social media. So I feel it gives us a chance to kind of keep the dialogue going even past the projects that we've worked on. So those are just a couple of things that I've really done and learned to leverage and get good at, so I can feel like, hey, I'm sharing in that collective purpose, and I'm a part of that community as well as this community here locally. I don't know if anybody on the call is a hybrid or a remote employee, if they have anything to add to that, or if they have shared sentiments, but it's certainly made an impact for me.
Thanks, Sandra. And I think some of your tips and tricks will work for folks like Ryan in the chat, who was asking about how you sort of not just build a brand, but also reset a brand when folks are not necessarily seeing you in that way. So that's super helpful. You talked about the strategy of using social media, all the ways you can do that. The Government of Canada's, the Federal Public Service, I think, use Twitter quite well in that space. GC Twitter is pretty active. LinkedIn was a big thing for us during the pandemic for Manitoba's Public Service, where we created a private group that was kind of like our virtual water cooler, and a few hundred of us would keep chatting there when we felt that sense of loneliness. There's no question that social media has a lot of potential for us in managing our brand and reaching out beyond, but particularly as folks who've grown up with social media, it also is a bit of a risk and a threat for us, right? There's folks who have been posting to social media for decades without ever thinking that they'd be public servants. I wonder about that side of it. And maybe we'll go to Helena first. Do you have examples or thoughts about do's and don'ts from a hiring perspective about how social media may have been a challenge?
Yeah, and it is a challenge. I think for particularly young people entering the workforce, they need to understand that, potential employers will actually look at social media as part of their recruitment process. And so, what you post publicly is available publicly. And you shouldn't post anything publicly unless you're comfortable that, a potential employer will read, the story, will see the pictures that you post, because not that, we all know that when you're 18, you might do things that you regret when you're 25, but, it's long lasting. It's not easy to change some of the social media that's out there. So some of the do's, I think, just particularly as people are starting out in their careers, is that just to be really aware that whatever you post publicly is public. And, and it doesn't mean that you can't be personal on social media. Of course you can, but it should be work appropriate personal. And, certainly, and I think, Sandra, you did a great job talking about how you use social media, particularly being 100% remote. I think that game has changed significantly, and I think it's more important than ever. And it's not something I had to do building my career, because social media wasn't even open to us or available. Some of the don'ts, another don't. We had an employee. I'll share a story. We had an employee who worked within our organization, within the HR organization. Very, very active employee on social media, particularly LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. And the nature of this employee's job was such that when this individual posted, it could be interpreted that they were posting on behalf of the company, because sometimes the lines blur. Are you posting as Helena Gotchling, or are you posting as the Chief Human Resources Officer of RBC? And the 5 years that I was CHRO, anything I put on LinkedIn would be as CHRO. Very hard to just post as Helena Gotchling. So just to be aware of that. And this individual just posts too frequently. It was always on the same topic. It actually had a detrimental impact on this individual's brand internally within the organization. We had to speak to the individual multiple times, that they over-rotated on one topic in particular, and external viewed it as this individual speaking on behalf of RBC. And, and that's a danger. So it's finding the right balance when you're using social media. Remember what role you have, what your title is, how you use that title on social media, and whether or not people reading your social media are reading it as you as Helena Gotchling, or you as your role with whomever you work for. And I think it's particularly challenging for people in the public service as well. When you're posting views on whether it be our immigration policy or whatever it might be, or sharing articles that lean towards a particular view, that you just have to be comfortable that you'll be associated with that view, and is that okay in your work environment? So it's tough, because anything you do is public, and that's where the alignment comes in. Hopefully that your work aligns with your personal values, hence your posts should align with the values of your organization. So that alignment is really, really critical. So just some of the do's and don'ts: make sure you don't over rotate, make sure you're not too frequent, and that you don't just anchor on one topic, that you kind of just keep going at it over and over and over again.
When your comment about alignment is so important, having moved through 3 different public services, the standards, the expectations are different depending on organization, right? I've worked in public services where interacting with elected officials online in terms of liking their policy announcements was totally normal. And in other public services where that would be seen as an undue partisan act, right? That you're starting to interact in a way that's not healthy. So knowing your organization and its standards is so valuable in that space too. We're coming to the end, and I'm going to kick it back to David in just a moment, but maybe back to our panelists for one final word, a thought that's sitting with you as we think about communications in the workplace, new professionals, brand, and how we show up. Sandra?
Yeah, I think, on the last question of sort of, balancing your personal interest and ideas with sort of, the views of the organization that you're part of. Just if I can add on to what Helena had said, I think, again, like that authenticity and balancing the two dualities between, for me, Sandra, the private citizen that has passions and specific views and opinions about something, and balancing that with Sandra, the dutiful public servant that has agreed to uphold the values of the organization to which I belong. That duality that we just spoke about is so important. And in striking that balance, I don't think there's a perfect recipe, honestly. I think it's about exercising good judgment. And every situation will be a little bit differently. If you're unsure whether the message or the content or your social media post will create a relationship breakdown, will offend somebody, don't post it. Don't post it. Spend some tender time socializing it before you post it. Sit on it. Ask yourself, why am I posting this? Why is this sensitive? Send it to a trusted leader, a colleague, a mentor to read it over for a second perspective, a second set of eyes. Once you fracture the relationship, it's really hard coming back to it rather than honing on it and being proactive and being really diligent with what you're actually putting up there. So intent is really important. However, in saying that, I think that you have to ask yourself, like, what is the trade-off? What are the benefits of this story or of this post compared to the potential negative backlash that may or may not follow? I think whenever we say something in our communications, in the way that we show up in the workplace, in our posts, in the way that we write, there is always undoubtedly going to be room for misinterpretation. Guess what? Somebody's always going to misinterpret what you say. Should that be reason enough to stay away and stifle and not be vocal? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm a big fan of democracy, which is why I'm in this line of work. I'm a big fan of standing up, voicing your opinions. It's how you do them, in what setting, and what your tone is, right? That matters. So you just have to be prepared, I think, for that backlash. And only you know the answer to, do I still, with the risk that this might rub somebody the wrong way, do I still want to put it out there because the potential benefits and positive impact that this might have in all of these people's lives over here is more important to me. How does that sit with you? What does that ratio look like? And letting that guide your intent and how you approach a difficult conversation or a social media post or engagement. So I think there's always a trade-off. It might offend a few people. How many people? How might they be offended? How much damage control do you want to do versus being proactive? And how does it sit with you? At the end of the day, are you okay with taking that risk? And just kind of going with that. So that's kind of what I have to say about that balance. And it sucks because there's no roadmap, right? There's no perfect roadmap. You kind of have to deliver it and develop it for yourself and go with it and be okay with it. So.
Lena, final word before we hand it back to David.
Yeah, I know we're short on time. Great feedback, Sandra, and guidance to the folks on the line. I would add, be authentic, be values-based, don't over orchestrate, and at the same time, don't do things in the heat of the moment. I think that speaks to Sandra's advice around sharing a post if you think it's going to be controversial before posting it. I used to coach leaders, and it relates to either email exchanges or social media, that usually if you sit on something overnight, particularly if it's a highly controversial topic, you might change the tone somewhat the day two, rather than responding in the heat of the moment. So those would be my words of advice. Brand is, again, so much bigger than social media, but social media absolutely, you can absolutely influence your brand internally and externally through the use of digital, through the use of social media.
Thanks so much for that. And thanks for the time you spent today. I've learned a few things. I think we're all still building our brands and learning how to communicate in the workplace. So I appreciate your insights. And I'll hand it back to David to take us through what's next for us today.
Well, thanks very much. That was great. And shocking that Matt is calling politicians by their first name. Wow, good for you. Impressive. I really loved your comments around how we all had to adopt in terms of working from home and the new communications around that, and the importance of alignment. And certainly one thing that resonated with me, and I learned this both playing and coaching competitive sports, and that is the 24-hour rule. When you're really passionate about something, as Sandra said, think about it, test it with somebody before you actually put it down. That was a great panel. I took a lot of great notes for follow-up. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insight with us. It's wonderful. We're going to have our last break, a chance to get a drink, just to stretch, and we'll be back at 2:50, and you're going to have a chance to hear from some emerging leaders across Canada. So join us at 2:50. Thanks so much.